Hi, today we're going to review the access management. Within our firewall, we can define multiple type of users. We can have local users, remote users that will come from an external source like LDAP or FortiAuthenticator. And also we can bundle those into user groups for better management within our policies. When we're going to set up the admin access, there are multiple steps that we need to consider. Where we're going to define that, meaning the interface, what type of protocols we're going to use in that particular interface that we would like to enable, and how we want to do it. Do we want to do it through the GUI under network interfaces, or we can also do it through a CLI with the set allow access command. A few of the best practices for management access is to never use unsecured protocols like HTTP and Telnet, and just pick the better option, a more secure option, HTTPS and SSH. Again, those access can be configured from the GUI or the CLI. And also, as a best practice, always for admin access, define a limited source of endpoints that can connect to our firewall for management using the trusted host. We can enable two-factor authenticator for the administrators. This built-in, the FortiGate can do email verification, but if we have the FortiTokens and FortiAuthenticator, we can leverage that and start using the tokens for a more secure and robust authentication. When we receive a brand new firewall, one of the things that we want to do with that is make sure the license is correctly applied, because that will unlock all the features for our firewall, and also to register that with FortiCare for support and ease of use when we need to do any type of escalation of ticketing with FortiGate. Also, when we receive our new firewall, once we have the licensing and the FortiCare registration out of the way, there are a few things that we want to configure, like we want to change the default passwords. We want to make sure it is using the latest code. We want to set the time. We want to set password policies, how often we're going to change them, how secure and long the password needs to be, and other settings over here and there. I would highly recommend to always check the hardening guide that Fortinet provide for the firewalls. If we go back to our demo computer, I have it here for 7.40. The hardening guide will go through most of the settings that you want to set up at the beginning of your firewall, admin access, the system time, how to configure logging optimally. This is probably going to suggest, obviously, that you have FortiAnalyzer, so they get more money out of it. But other elements like the firmware, how can we set the encrypted protocols, how can we define cipher. For example, this one I really like. The strong cipher is enabled by default, but all the weak ones are also enabled, but we can go there and disable that. Most people don't do that. So pay attention to the hardening guide for the FortiOS and apply those policies when they are appropriate for your environment. Let's go back to the slides. And we keep just talking about all those things that are good practices when we are configuring FortiGate for the first time, like setting up the password retries and locked-out time. This is not for a first-time firewall, but if something happens with our firewall and we need to do a factory reset or recover the admin password, we're going to use the maintainer account, which is only enabled after we reboot the firewall for a short period of time. We need the console access for this. And the password for that maintainer account is going to be, as you can see on step 7, it's just the BCPB plus the particular serial number for the firewall that you have. And again, this account is only going to be available for the first seconds after a reboot. So if you are not able to log in within that time frame, then you are forced to reboot that again. Once we have access, we can reset the admin password by going to the config system admin, edit the admin user, and set a new password for that account. The firewall built-in is going to come with different admin profiles to provide to the administrators or the reviewers, if we have those in our environment, just the correct access for each person. It could be read-only access, it could be admin access, or we can define our own profiles to provide access just to certain sections of our firewall. I see this commonly like if you have a senior level person at the NOC, for example, instead of giving them full access to the firewall, maybe they can have access to their logs, or maybe they can have access to only the policy section just for review and small modifications. The super admin profile is obviously going to provide you with full access to the firewall that we discussed earlier. We can also use the read-only or define a custom one as needed. Talking about external users and external authentication, we can also configure radius in our firewall. This is important for the test because we need to understand the flow and the messages that the firewall is going to exchange with the radius server. When we have an attempt of connection, the connection request, that access request will get forwarded to the radius server, which then is going to challenge us. In this case will be the firewall, and the firewall is just going to relay that challenge to the user so we can validate and authenticate that person using the remote server. Here's a snippet of the configuration if we do it through the CLI. Here we have a few commands that we can use to test our radius servers and how to troubleshoot it as well with the diagnostics debug. I really like the test radius command. We can do that the same for LDAP too. And it's just an easy way, since we can see what is the answer from the radius server directly on the CLI and why that connection or authentication failed. It is also important for the test that we understand all the steps for a LDAP authentication. It's very similar to radius in the sense that we are sending the information to an external server, and that server is going to challenge us for authentication. It's just, since it's a different protocol, the steps and the name for those steps are slightly different, but just keep in mind what are those steps for your test. Here we have what's the configuration for the LDAP server if we do it through the CLI. And similar to radius, we have the test, which actually says test radius, but it will be the test LDAP, as you can see by the diagnose test authent server LDAP, and how can we troubleshoot that if needed. With our firewall, we can also do single sign-on without going for the more expensive solution of FortiGate Authenticator. This will require to install a piece of software on a Windows server if you're using Active Directory, Microsoft Active Directory. And the collector is going to analyze and be reading all the logs from the Windows server. That way it's going to determine and be able to track, hey, user X just logged in on computer Y with this IP, and that information is going to be transmitted to the firewall. Now we know that Bob is using IP or is sitting at the device with IP X, and we can do the correct correlation and tracking of that. For the diagnose the FSO logins, we can make sure the DNS for the IP configuration, I'm sorry, for the hostname of the computers is correctly set up, and also the integration with the collector that we're going to see in a moment. And since we can track the users thanks to the collector, we can also combine that with the security groups that we have defined for our policies. For troubleshooting, we can use the diagnose, debug, out FSSO, and the list and the refresh logins are just going to give us additional data for those events. The single sign-on collector I was mentioning earlier that we need to install on the Windows Active Directory server is just a small piece of software that we get from Fortinet, and it's just we just need to go really through the wizard for the installation. It's not something we're going to lab, unfortunately, for this course. We have other pressing matters that we want to see, but just be aware that it exists. We just need to follow up the wizard and make sure that the account that we're going to use there for authentication with the firewall is the correct one, and we need to obviously define the firewall configuration. Since the collector is being installed directly on the Windows server, it's going to discover any domains, Active Directories that we may have. So again, we just need to follow up the wizard so we can complete that piece, and we can identify which groups or organization units we're going to be monitoring. Finally, once it is installed, we're going to see a window similar to the one we have on the screen, where we can tweak a few more settings and ports for the connectivity if those are not working, and obviously the password for to communicate with FortiGate. Just additional steps for the collector, but once we have that on the firewall, we just need to go and define who is going to be our LDAP endpoint, since we also need to have all the settings in the OU that we're going to use for that. And we can, as you can see on the screen, we have the test connectivity and test user credentials to make sure that everything is set up correctly. Once we have the LDAP configuration, we just need to have the stitch, the fabric connector to that collector to tie those both pieces together. And finally, if we didn't define the groups earlier, we can also define the groups here of the ones that we are going to start monitoring and apply the policies from. And here is just when we are creating that group, we're just saying it's a Fortinet single sign-on object. And finally, once we have all that, I mean, we did all that process, we installed the collector, we configure the stitch, not a stitch, the fabric connector as well to communicate with our Active Directory. Why we're doing all that? So we can apply it on our policies. We are not only going to have a policy allowing certain traffic, that policy is going to be valid for this particular subset of users that we already have identified. If we don't have an authorized user, if you are not an authorized user, or we haven't identified you, we are not going to give you access, or the policy is not going to give you the access that is listed there. And now for our lab, we're going to set up quick local user, since I cannot demo the full blown out Active Directory plus collector, but just keep in mind that it will work very similarly in the sense of like, if you are not an authorized user, we either authorize you or you don't get the access needed. So if we go to user and authentication, user definitions, I already created my Bruce Wayne account, nothing fancy, just a username. I already have a password for that. It's enabled and it's a local user. Easy peasy. I don't have second factor authentication enabled for this particular user, but just keep in mind that it's possible. If we go to our firewall policies, we have a firewall policy which at the moment does not have a user. So everybody, anything can use this. But if we go to the source and we include our Bruce Wayne user, so now this policy can only be used by an authorized Bruce Wayne account. Other users and or devices, if we haven't identified those, they are not going to be able to gain the access this policy is allowing. And since we don't have anything else, then the traffic will be dropped. So let me go to my remote desktop here. Perfect. Let me close this from previous sessions. Let's launch Firefox. And now let's just try to go to Facebook, see what happens. So the policy is trying to determine who we are. It say, hey, wait, I can give you access if you get authenticated. So let's open the network login page. If you see sending me to the firewall private IP, and we see this login splash screen, and it's trying to say, hey, who are you? Well, I'm Bruce Wayne. And once we have it, now that we were able to authenticate, now we can go to Facebook and it opened this. It's just Firefox telling me, hey, this is what just happened. But as you can see, since we already been authenticated, we can just go to any website really. On the flip side, if we had not been authenticated or my credentials were incorrect, then that access will have not been released to me and I wouldn't have any access. If we go back to the slides, just as a summary, remember all the steps that we need to do when we have a new firewall. We don't want to jump directly to start configuring policies and applications. We want to take care of the firewall itself first. Make sure it's updated, make sure all the security is enhanced for it, do the hardening, and then we can also create all the administrator users that are going to be managing that firewall, and how can also we can bring additional information from other systems like the Active Directory to consume that information and make a better use of our policies. Thank you.